Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our series of Professional Advisors Working Lunches. Today, we're pleased to welcome back our good friends at Schroders. I'm Hope Williams-Smith, editor of Professional Advisor, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Now, before we get going with today's session, let me quickly run you through some of the usual housekeeping. So just once again, your microphones and cameras are currently switched off, and we'd be really grateful if you could please keep them that way, just to ensure that there's no background noise, and so our speakers can be heard nice and clearly. I should also inform you that this session is being recorded, and we will send you a link of the recording by tomorrow, and do feel free to share this with your colleagues. Now, as usual, today's working lunch will qualify for 1 hour of CPD, and we'll be sending your proof of attendance along with the link to the recording of the session, and that's going to arrive in your inboxes tomorrow. Now, over the last couple of years, our readers have really engaged with the results of the now very familiar Schroders Advisor Pulse survey. I'm delighted to be joined today by their Intermediary Solutions Director, Gillian Hepburn, and Investment Director of Schroders Investment Solutions, Olivia Geldenhuys, who will give us an update on the latest Pulse survey, which covers a really wide range of topics on advisor views on the market, the cost of living crisis, artificial intelligence, consumer duty, and also some of the key challenges facing financial advisors right now. And to add to that, of course, an advisor's point of view, we will be welcoming back a good friend of Professional Advisor, Unique Financial Planning's Managing Director, Philip Martin. Do feel free to put any and all of your questions to our guests using the chat function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. If you wish to remain anonymous when you ask a question, simply select my name from the drop-down list in the chat box before you type your messages, and only I will be able to see it. So, just before I hand over to Gillian, let me quickly run you through our learning objectives for today's session. So, at the end of today's presentation, you should be able to understand views on the investment market in April and May of 2023, how they've changed and the future predictions, be able to discuss the importance of client conversations on cash versus long-term investing and the benefits and disadvantages of these, as well as being able to explain the potential challenges in relation to artificial intelligence, the cost of living crisis, and consumer duty as we move further into H2 2023. So that is our CPD covered, and I'm now ready to welcome Gillian Hepburn from Schroders. Good afternoon, Gillian.
Afternoon, Hope, and I'm just having a slight challenge with these slides, but 2 secs. So thank you very much for having us this afternoon. We're always delighted to talk about the Schroders Advisor Pulse survey. Just as a quick reminder, we started our annual survey back in 2014, so that makes next year 10 years of the main survey. But 3 years ago, we decided to have what we called a pulse survey. And that was in the COVID era, if I could call it that. We wanted to find out what advisors were thinking, feeling, how they were engaging with clients. So we conducted an online survey, and it was so popular that we've now replicated that for 3 years. So this is our interim survey, but there's just loads of interesting information on it, hopefully, for everybody on the call today. It was completed by 180 advisors, so certainly a robust sample in terms of the advisor community. So first of all, I'm actually going to hand over to Olivia, who's the investment director here, and she's going to talk about how clients are feeling about their investments at this point in time.
Great, thanks, Gillian. It's great to be here and to have this conversation with you. And I think if we can really just start thinking about the different sentiments that we're actually seeing play out across the client base. And what I always find fascinating with this is how it actually has changed over time. So what we're seeing at the moment is that people are more bearish. You know, we felt that people were very bearish if we look at the November results from the survey, and we've seen this move now to more slightly bearish. But also what's really interesting is how that's then spaced into the more neutral view that people have. And I think this is really quite understandable, because if we think about how much volatility is present in the market at the moment and how much things are moving around, we've had 3 really significant events just over a very short period of time, that I think there might be a bit of confusion from people. They may be seeing clients who really don't know what to do. So sitting in that more neutral space, I think is quite an interesting position to have seen that change over time as we move to that. If we just have a look at our next slide, we were looking at what are some of the factors that clients are most concerned about in this environment. And I always think it's quite interesting if we're thinking about the average age of clients. So what we're seeing as being the biggest concern for people is really around that capital loss. And again, that ties really into the volatility numbers that we're seeing. You start seeing that capital value being depreciated. And if clients are in a drawdown phase, then it does make sense really that we're seeing capital losses being more of a concern. Interestingly, on the flip side, we've got rising interest rates not being a concern. And I think this is a bit of a double-edged sword, because ultimately rising interest rates are there to control inflation. So we see inflation as a concern for people, but they're not as concerned about interest rates. And I think that potentially points to the fact that interest rates are affecting those with mortgages, and that's where you're really feeling that pinch on the purse. And for those clients who maybe don't have mortgages or mortgage-free, those rising interest rates actually don't feel as big of a concern for clients, but actually it's the inflation number that's still going to be affecting absolutely everybody, because it affects how much you're able to spend. And then when you're actually saving, it's then also affecting how much more disposable income you have available to save. So an interesting kind of mix that we're seeing, but capital loss really being the main concern coming out. If we just have a look at the kind of topic of the moment, really, I feel, is around whether you should be investing for the long term, or whether you should be looking at cash deposits. And this is actually a relatively new question for us in the Pulse survey. And what we're seeing is that people are actually having these conversations about whether or not they should think about long-term investing versus cash deposits, which at the moment are providing you with some really great yields and at that kind of risk-free environment. But I think with everything, it's about diversification, and it's about understanding what kind of returns are you trying to generate in a real world. So from an inflation perspective, inflation is always going to be eating into cash deposits. And so those, even if you're getting 5%, for example, inflation is still going to be higher than that. And you're never going to be able to outweigh inflation by purely investing in cash. I might do a bit of a shameless plug here. We recently recorded a video with 2 of our portfolio managers looking at the concept of investing versus sitting in cash. And we've had this retail complied. So if anyone's interested, please go have a look on our website. We've got a really nice video having a bit of an explanation, a conversation around this. And I think that's what's really important. And certainly from the survey, we're seeing that 90% of people are actually having those conversations. If we then have a look at whether people are actually changing their plans, and I think this is interesting because, we're speaking about cost of living, it's really starting to actually bite. And we are starting to see that clients are tending to need to adjust their plans accordingly. Now, unfortunately, this isn't available for absolutely everybody to adjust their plans, but it does give us quite an interesting discussion point to understand how can people actually change their plans relative to the cost of living crisis that we're actually faced with at the moment. And so what we're seeing is that 25% of people report that more than 25% of their clients are actually having to adjust their plans. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic, and certainly where the power of a financial advisor comes into play in helping people adjust their plans. If we then have a look at what some of the reasons are for people wanting to adapt and making sure that they're able to sustain their incomes over the next while, we're actually seeing that it's about higher household expenses. And that's what's really adjusted people from over the last 12 months to actually change their financial plans. Another interesting point is really around helping wider family. And I think this points into the generational side of financial planning for people, where, potentially you've got children who maybe aren't able to actually support their mortgages and who then need that assistance from their parents. So again, an interesting collection of why people might need to change their plans and adding to those conversation points that we can have.
Philip, I'm just going to interrupt at this point because obviously there was a lot in that first little section in terms of advisors, speaking to clients about, cash, about interest rates and inflation. Is that what you're experiencing with clients?
It is. I mean, obviously, the points that Olivia is making, excuse me, are around a general totality of audience. But I think in our experience, it's much more segmented. So Olivia's made a very relevant point, that people's concerns about interest rates tend to be if they still have significant mortgage commitments, and that's impinging on monthly free cash. Likewise, depending on where a client is on their savings journey, if they're at the aggregation phase and perhaps saving on a regular basis, that's having far more of an effect on people who are further on in their savings journey and are actually looking towards moving to disaggregation. We do note the point about cash returns, particularly at the cautious risk end of the marketplace. There's definitely a move where people are seeing, albeit you're still in negative real return territory, people are seeing that they are massively attractive relative to taking the risk on of a cautious portfolio. But I would think that will unwind pretty sharply, actually, as you start to see the projected yield curve play out over the next 12 to 18 months. The other thing that I would say, obviously this was very much coming from an investment point of view. The one other thing that we tend to find every single time there's a pinch on household budgets is not related to investment. It's actually related to other things that get dropped, most notably protection. People see that as protection premiums, they see as something that's a sort of easy win to get some cash back on. And unless we have got the strength of the relationship and the planning relationship to throw protection into the mix, sometimes there can be some very, very unintended consequences of dropping that cover. And I guess that will be familiar to everybody on the call.
Yeah, Philip, I thought also the piece around helping the wider family was interesting. You know, with consumer duty on the horizon, you know, it's thinking about the value of advice, and certainly, you know, our view on this was helping wider families really interesting. But is that being done in a tax efficient manner, and how an advisor can help there? Also, in terms of thinking about inheritance tax planning, you know, is it a gift or a loan, and is money that's been taken out of a portfolio being taken from the right tax wrapper? So there's a lot of financial planning, I think, in there as well.
Massive around doing it in the right order in the most advantageous way, and that doesn't even need to be cascading down. It could just be help and support for the family, you know, sure, towards either to you know, to get a deposit to buy a first home, or alternatively, even in some cases we're seeing now with day-to-day living expenses.
Sure, but I'm sure we can cover that a bit later on as well. I'm going to move on to market trends. So Olivia, if you want to move on to the next section.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian. I think, you know, if we're looking at some of those market trends, that's also something that is quite interesting to see how it plays out over time. And you can kind of see how it's really driven by what's actually happening in the marketplace. And so what we're seeing really around this is that 31% of advisors are actually expecting equity market returns to be lower than historical averages over the next 5 years. And again, if we can almost pull it back to that sentiment that we're seeing with clients and seeing a lot of volatility actually in the marketplace where they're seeing big movements. I mean, we just need to reflect on what 2022 looked like. And so seeing that actual shift between what we're expecting from a return perspective in equities versus what we're actually anticipating to get out of the bond space is quite interesting as we move through time, and there's different news flows actually happening. Something else obviously that we look at is around thinking about growth, thinking about inflation, and thinking about interest rates, because all of these things are really intertwined. And so what we're actually seeing is that we've got people expecting that there will be lower interest rates over the next 5 years. And again, I think, you know, central banks have quite a challenge that they face in they have to raise interest rates to try and control inflation, but ultimately the goal would be to kind of bring things back to a lower level. I think we are moving out of this world, though, where we are going to be at zero or even negative rates. So lower is going to be an interesting one if we think about how that will play out into the next 5 years. How low will that actually be? So interesting to kind of see that shift taking place. And then if we think about what are some of the technological trends that we're seeing playing out, and again, you know, we think about how popular ChatGPT has been, and I know, you know, Gillian, you've done some work around this, but those technological advances are fascinating. And I think, you know, it's kind of something that if you're not talking about it, certainly from an investment perspective, then you're pretty much living under a rock. But what's interesting for advisors is how might they actually be able to harness these technological disruptions to actually improve productivity, to improve efficiency, which hopefully then filters through into actually delivering better outcomes for clients.
Thanks, Olivia. We're going to move on to sustainability, but I don't know, Philip, if there's anything to add in terms of the slides that Olivia's just covered in terms of these market trends. I mean, I think people are hoping, aren't we, that interest rates will start to come down, that inflation will start to come down, but it's a challenging time in terms of we haven't got a crystal ball on all of this.
Well, also it's a bit of a one club strategy, and if the medicine doesn't seem to be working, then I think we're in a far deeper problem, aren't we? But I think history would suggest that it will work. It will be painful, as the thing unwinds, and everybody just has to hold their nerve. And I think some of the points that you've raised earlier in the conversation, they remain as valid in difficult times as they do in good times. That the benefits of a long-term plan that can be adjusted will always outweigh not having a plan at all.
Spot on, absolutely, and we can unpack some of that later in the Q&A as well. So if we move quickly on to sustainability, basically what the survey was telling us was that I guess advisors' level of confidence in terms of talking about sustainability was starting to dip. If you see on the right hand side of this chart, it shows that advisors back in November 21 were really quite confident about speaking to clients about sustainability. And then it's really dropped down now to only 6% saying, I'm very confident about doing this. It was interesting, we wondered about the timing of this survey. Obviously, we've seen SDR being put back in fact again, in terms of some of the product labelling, and also this whole piece around having to ask clients about sustainability preferences. So interesting here that I guess it's coming off a little bit. And for us, this is just a bit of, what can we do to help, and how can we help advisors, just continue to upskill in terms of sustainability. If we look at the next slide, again, no huge change, I guess, in terms of number of clients asking for sustainable investing. Sort of slightly small increases, but predominantly no change here. And I think if we look at the next slide, it's probably no surprise that it was effectively performance challenges that's led to this slightly suppressed appetite for sustainable solutions. But our message, last year, and I'm sure Olivia can cover some of the detail on this, last year was a bit of a challenging time for sustainable investments, and we pretty much know the reasons for that. But if it is a long-term, we're playing a long-term game here in terms of investing with clients. So it maybe seems strange that 1 year had such a significant impact. But also we saw that increased scepticism was beginning to play out as well in terms of sustainable investing. And I guess that's something for us here at Schroders to make sure that we try and tackle this. What is scepticism, and what's that stemming from? Things like active ownership, engagement, it's really important for us. So it's about just making sure that we're getting the right messages out to advisors and their clients in this one. The next one, we looked very briefly at private market investments. You may be aware that we were one of the first providers, I think the first actually, to launch an LTAF to the market. So private assets is a really interesting space for us, where we do believe that clients can get access to alternative investments. And I think for me, it was really interesting to see that the number has not quite, but almost doubled in terms of the number of advisors that are now considering using private market investments with their clients. And I think over the next year or so, this will be very interesting. The regulators obviously changed and will enable us to offer private asset solutions to more the retail mass market, but it's how we package that up will be potentially a challenge. We're already engaging with platforms to think about how we might be able to deploy a solution in this space. And then if we move on to multi-asset investing, I guess this one was maybe a bit of a shameless plug for our global multi-asset portfolios, where we're offering an active solution at 22 basis points. So we did ask about, would you be, if a fully active multi-asset fund with an investment process that was proven and equivalent charges to a passive fund, would you be likely to recommend it? And 86% of advisors said that they would. So again, it's just an interesting one. And I don't like to call it the active passive debate. We are always believers that it's not binary any longer. We do run a blended solution which combines active and passive, but it was certainly one to throw in just to get a feel for advisors on this one. And then crypto snuck this one in as well, only because about a year ago, we saw that only 20% of advisors were concerned about young people investing in crypto and digital assets. Now, I feel this is actually part of the wealth transfer story, and as many of you on the call are probably aware that this is a big topic for me. But my concern here is if we don't start to get a little bit more engaged in this debate and upskill ourselves in terms of crypto, digital assets, but actually what the technology could represent going forward in terms of delivering different types of solutions and thinking about how we engage young people, then we could be in danger of becoming obsolete, both as advisors and as asset managers, in terms of thinking about that next generation, how they're behaving, how they're investing. But it was really interesting for me to see that we'd moved only in the space of 6 months from 20% of advisors being concerned up to 68%. So maybe my little chats out in the market are, I don't want to take full credit for it clearly, but maybe my little conversations have helped. And if we look at the next slide, I think what was interesting was that 62% of advisors said they were adequately equipped to have these types of conversations. We launched a guide to digital and crypto assets some time ago. We did actually speak at the last PA conference in London, and if I was selling that guide, I might have made a fortune actually, because old-fashioned booklet, but they flew off the shelf, made an empty box by the end of the day. So again, whilst advisors are feeling adequately equipped, clearly there's still an opportunity to understand this in a bit more detail. So that guide is available for anybody that's interested. So Philip, a number of different areas there to think about. Anything that resonated with you as an advisor?
Yeah, well, I think the two really interesting areas are sustainable and crypto. So I think I'm not surprised at all with the shift in the sustainable number. I think you've only got to look at the result of the Uxbridge by-election last week to understand that people say one thing in good times when they don't think it's going to affect them making some of these changes, but if they're led to believe that it will, which of course it didn't in many cases last week, but they believed that it did, they ended up with a completely different view, and I think that is starting to play out in sustainability. In good times, people are all for it, but in times of cash-strapped budgets, it feels like a luxury they don't want to take just now, whatever the illogicality of it. So that did resonate. I think the crypto one is really interesting. I think because it has all sorts of implications. On the one level, it could be very, very good if a whole generation starts investing in crypto unwittingly, poorly advised, and has a bad experience. But a bad experience might put them off investing full stop. So it goes into a far deeper problem, I think, for advice. Also, the fact that we can't properly address it because it's not within the regulatory framework means it's a sort of asset class, in inverted commas, it's out there that we can kind of inform on, but can't really do anything about or make any definitive statements on. So I think for the regulator, it's sort of in the too difficult bucket, but at some stage it's going to need to be brought out of the too difficult bucket and incorporated in. You've only got to look at its penetration in the under 30s to realise that we're storing up a big problem if we don't tackle it.
Yeah, I just think it's such an interesting one, isn't it, in terms of what's happening. And at the end of the day, if young people are engaging and investing, that's got to be a good thing.
It's a great thing. It's a great thing, of course.
Got to be great.
We just need to get the story across that other asset classes do exist.
Yeah, sure. And that's one of the challenges that we always face. We get asked, how do crypto assets correlate with other asset classes? And I think it's really difficult. There was talk of it correlating to tech stocks or to gold, and I think it's still quite unclear. But my view is, if young people are engaging, then we've got to think about the future. If they're engaging elsewhere, then by the time they inherit wealth, will they behave very differently, and therefore use whatever it is on their hands that they're currently using to engage in crypto. So I guess that's just something for us to continue to think about.
I think that's right.
Yeah, so if we just move on, and look at the next section, which is consumer duty. Now, it wouldn't be a survey without asking about that, given where we are with only, I guess, a few days to go. This was obviously done back in May, and I think there's been a question. There was 180 advisors took part in this survey. And we asked them at that point, how well prepared were they for consumer duty? Great news, 77% of advisors said that they were in progress and they would be ready for the end of July. So I guess in the next few days, we'll find out if that's actually played out. 4% had said that they hadn't started. Hopefully they have by now. And many advisors felt that they were fully prepared. So, with this one, it's still early days. Who knows where we'll end up? But what was interesting for us in the next slide was we asked about the impact that consumer duty would have on advisor businesses. And if you look at the number that thought that it wouldn't have a significant impact, I think that's 39% on the left-hand side of this slide. I actually thought that was quite interesting. I mean, we've obviously been through consumer duty work ourselves here at Schroders. Within the Schroders Investment Solutions, we had to produce our fair value assessments and our target market document for the end of April. We're continuing to work on consumer understanding and review all of our materials. So certainly it's had an impact on us, particularly in terms of resource, but it's also, and I've always talked about this not being a box ticking exercise, but already having gone through all of that work, we have made changes. We've looked really hard at our service standards and how well we're achieving those, but also we're getting some great feedback from our consumer panel in terms of consumer understanding in relation to things like our quarterly reports. We'll also be reviewing videos that we produce. So there's still a lot of work to be done. So I thought it was quite interesting that there was a view that this would have a slightly lower impact in terms of advisor businesses. And then we asked about the 4 different outcomes, and the fair value outcome, advisors told us that that was the most difficult to prepare for, followed by consumer understanding. And I thought this was interesting that nearly 60% of advisors said that the fair value outcome would put pressure on ongoing charging models. Now, maybe that was the way that we asked this question, because you could interpret it as, is it the ongoing nature of the charge, or is it the cost itself? And in our November survey, we'll probably dig a little bit deeper into this one. But I just thought interesting that probably for the first time it felt that advisors were maybe concerned about this ongoing charging model and how will that work going forward? We are seeing different models emerging in the market, but for me, this was an interesting question and an interesting response. And then the last one, obviously for us as a provider of outsourced investment solutions, it was interesting that 25% of advisors thought that consumer duty would lead to an increased outsourcing of all or some of their investment proposition. And we're certainly seeing this playing out with many advisors not really grasping the fact that running advisory models meant that as a manufacturer, they were now having to undertake fair value assessments, target market documents, and really starting to think about outsourcing. So certainly consumer duty was giving us, I guess, a lot to think about and a lot to talk about. Clearly, one of the things that we want to do is help advisors as much as possible in terms of the piece of work that we're doing and how we can help. But also for us, I think it was about sharing the experience that we've been through to prepare and helping advisors where possible. So I think that was a key point on consumer duty. Before we come on to AI, maybe because consumer duty is such a big topic, Philip, do you have some views on where we are and what some of the challenges have been in terms of your business?
Yeah, well, it's clearly a massive topic. I think there probably is a mismatch between more generally how people feel about their businesses and the risks that they carry, and perhaps what the regulator might view the answer to that question. So, I mean, I think for us, 2 things really. One is I get frustrated a lot when people start to talk about charging models and how these need to change, at the inability of us more generally to articulate what our proposition is and why it is worth what it is. And you can see that most acutely in people believing that everything has to go back to being able to defend the charge in the context of an annual sit-down review meeting, as though that was the only thing a business ever did for a client. You know, we're corresponding with them regularly. We're keeping them up to date with things that are happening in the market. We're nudging them to take proactive decisions around their plan. We're educating the wider part of their family. We're here whenever they need them as a reactive service with staff that we have to pay for. There's any number of different things that widen out what that proposition is. So I think we've got to get far better at articulating what it is we are doing 12 months of the year, not for the hour and a half that we sit down to do a formal review of where you are. It's the first thing. And I think the second thing, which pretty much every business that, you know, hasn't just started in the last few years will have, is a difficulty in being able to match what it's charging different cohorts of clients for what is essentially the same service. And I think that that's a big point around fair value, is that the fact that historically, I mean, for a business like us with 30 advisors, that's given advisors a degree of autonomy on how to level charges historically, we'll have two clients virtually engaging with us in exactly the same way, being charged differently, and that eventually will need to be harmonized. You know, and you see that most acutely, I guess, in the businesses, the acquiring businesses, particularly, you know, the aggregators that have bought businesses that will have a wide disparity. So I don't think this is anywhere near done. I think we'll get to 31.7 and everyone will breathe a sort of sigh of relief, but I actually think the work will only just be beginning.
Yeah, you're right. I'm actually starting to write an article on consumer duty for a column that I do, and I'm talking about, you know, has it been consigned to the virtual filing cabinet, or is it actually driving a change? But going back to the ongoing charging model, I think the survey was really interesting on this one. I mean, and to your point, it's about all the other things that an advisor does. And if you think about some of the things that Olivia and I have covered up until now, it really points to advisors and the value of advice. So if you think about having those conversations about clients feeling neutral about investing and helping them navigate their way through what's happening in markets. The next one being that passing on wealth, you know, reshaping my plan to help the wider family. You know, again, that's a great opportunity for some good quality advice to think about how we do that. Cash deposits being another conversation. You know, we're being asked constantly by advisors to help with the cash deposit via long-term investing conversation. And then just that whole piece around reshaping the plan. I think my concern on moving away from an ongoing charging model is assumes then that the client knows when they need to take advice. Yeah. Whereas you are actually proactive in terms of this is what's happening and we're going to keep in touch with you, would be my view.
Yeah. Which I completely agree. Absolutely is the way it has to be articulated. I completely agree with that.
I agree with you, Philip, just on the, you know, actually being able to articulate what value you add. And I often say, you know, what's the price of peace of mind? How do you actually put a monetary value on how much your peace of mind is worth? Because I think you only really know how much it's worth when you no longer have it. And unfortunately, it's quite difficult to put that down into pounds and pence, and certainly difficult to put it down as a percentage. So I think that is a big challenge.
Yeah, and I think if we don't start getting better at doing this faster, particularly as the trade bodies re-engage back in with the regulator, I do fear that we sleepwalk our way into a belief that all of this is all about, 12-minute blocks of time build back. And it's just not, because the risk isn't related to time. The risk of giving advice is related to the size of the investment, because that's what you'll be paying out if you get it wrong. You know, so it's a complete misnomer, and we need to be far smarter and sharper around how we articulate what it is we do and why we're worth what it is we charge and how we charge it.
Yeah, I mean, I think also with consumer duty, we're hitting a phase, aren't we, of evolution, not revolution. We're not all going to turn up on the 1st of August or whenever it is, put the lights on and we're in a new world. This is going to take time to bed down. You know, we know already as a manufacturer, we've been able to look at what we've done and compare across the market in terms of what does good practice look like? What could we do better the next time round? So I do think that this will evolve as people start to look at, what is good practice and how can we do better. So I think we've got some interesting times ahead on this one, but hopefully it's not confined to the filing cabinet, because we've certainly here already made a number of changes on the back of the work that we've done for Consumer Duty. So it's got to be a good thing.
Yeah.
I've got 2 slides just to finish with, and this plays back to something that Olivia covered earlier in terms of the disruption theme, where we saw that the technological disruption had kind of increased again. And it was interesting because back during COVID, we'd seen an increase in people thinking about disruption and technology, and then that fell way back. And then suddenly with this survey, the impact of technological advances had increased quite significantly. So we decided to ask a little bit more about why we thought AI might be an interesting topic. And actually, for me, it was interesting. 57% of advisors said that they thought that the AI technology application, so ChatGPT, for example, represented an opportunity for the business. So that's an interesting one. And if you look at the next slide, we asked about incorporating this in some way in the advice process. And if you look at the slide here, 51% of advisors said that they expected this to happen some point over the next year or between 2 and 5 years. So it feels like AI is firmly on the agenda. I guess what I'm keen to ask in the next survey in November is, in what way do we think that this might be incorporated? Is it simply to help write suitability reports or write emails, or so it's more about doing some heavy lifting on some of the written work that we need to do, or are there other ways that we think that AI can be helpful in terms of the actual advice process? Philip, I'm not sure if you've got any views on this one.
Well, thankfully, I think by the time it becomes dominant, I shan't have to worry about it. But I think it absolutely will start to impact, and probably, I think everybody sees how it can start to make bits of the back office faster, more efficient, and actually more accurate, probably in time. And I think in a still a paper report driven regulatory environment, I think that will help enormously. That's going to help everyone on this call's cost base eventually very positively. But I can also see how it can expand into helping clients better understanding the choices that they might make. I mean, the ability to, model different scenarios and discuss the outcomes with sensible probabilities of likely outcome and produce that in a simple way that doesn't involve an advisor reading it back out from a script is going to be very powerful. But I'm not one of those people that regards this as an existential threat. I think if the robots are genuinely going to take over from the humans entirely, then to paraphrase my earlier point, we've got a far deeper problem, don't we? So I still believe a core part of what it is we do is the ability to look people in the eye, to have a bond of trust, for them to know that you're on their side, to articulate difficult stuff in a straightforward way that they can understand, and that will always need human input. So I think it's enormously exciting. I'd love to know who thinks that they're going to be harnessing it in the next 12 months, because I think it might need quite a lot of testing before you let it loose on the general public. But so I sort of get the 2 to 5 year horizon, probably more than I get the 12-month one. I think that's rather gung-ho. But I think it offers fantastic opportunities to make the advice process deeper, stronger, better, and actually improve the overall client relationship and deepen the bond of trust that they have with businesses. I don't think we should fear it at all.
Yeah, I completely agree, actually. I think it's quite exciting in terms of what can happen. And my view is robots don't do empathy. So there you go. I am with you on this one in terms of it should take away some of the heavy lifting and enable us to spend more time doing what clients value, which is spending time with them, whether that be once a year or on an ongoing basis, as per our previous debate. So I just think it's a really interesting time that we're now living in with some of these capabilities and opportunities.
I've employed a few robots in my time anyway, so it might be nice to program and control them a bit better, to be honest.
Well, that's us reached the end of the survey. I think I'm going to hand over to Hope now in terms of some of the Q&A.
Thanks so much to Gillian and Philip and Olivia for all of their thoughts so far. So as Gillian said, we do have a little bit of time for Q&A now, 15 minutes or so. So if you would like to ask a question, please just write it in the chat box and I will ask it as soon as I'm able. I've got a couple already and a few of my own. So what I think I might do is kick off with something quite broad. So one here for Gillian and Olivia. What was the biggest surprise that's come out of this most recent survey?
Wow, what a great question to start with. So I guess for me, well, there's two areas. One is the cash debate. We knew that it was happening, but we didn't realise the scale, I would say. So the fact that 9 out of 10 advisors were saying that they're speaking to clients about cash deposits. And I think, to be fair, since May, that's probably only increased given where we are with cash rates. But secondly, I suppose for me, it was that last piece on AI. Whilst it was a very hot topic in May and continues to be, I think I was quite surprised at the response from advisors in terms of the possibilities of this. So I guess for me, that was probably my two key areas. I don't know, Olivia, if you have a different view.
I mean, I definitely agree on the cash side of things. I think it begs such an interesting debate because you have a range of clients with a range of different needs and a range of different starting wealth positions, if I can say that. So I think it makes people think about the different elements of risk. You've got your willingness to take on risk, you have your ability to take on risk, and then you have your capacity for loss. And I think that, you've really got to think about all of those things together. Cash feels safe when there's been a lot of volatility in the market because you don't want to consume that risk. But just because you don't have the willingness to consume on risk doesn't mean that you actually have the ability to not take on risk. So I think that's it almost enhances the conversations that advisors can have with clients. And it's certainly given us a bit of food for thought when it comes to the investing side of things. How do we actually, position our proposition so that it's easily understood for where you might want to play in the cash space and where might you not? So I think that's interesting. And then I also always just think the crypto side is fascinating because I'm by no means an expert. And in fact, I would say I know maybe one person who knows a significant amount about crypto and what it actually means. And so I'm just always quite interested into what the views are people have, because I think similar to ChatGPT, that's the front end that we see. The whole ecosystem that sits behind something like AI is not always visible. And I don't think that, I don't think anyone can really claim to know that ecosystem when they have a day job that is not in AI or in crypto. So I think those are interesting areas.
Well, just picking up there on the key theme of AI that has been explored in there. Obviously quite a major part of what you've done this time round. I'm interested to hear, probably from all three of you really, why you think such a high percentage of advisors are seeing so much threat in that space.
Do you want to go first, Sol?
Do you want me to go first? I think that's okay. I think the threat here, isn't it? It's about young people behaving in a way that's different to how we would traditionally look at as investment. And I think the threat is, I always talk about my kids, so sorry, I'll be a bit boring for a minute, but during COVID, one of mine admitted that all their savings were in crypto. So failed as a mother in the multi-asset space, right? And then I had to think, well, why is that happening and why is he behaving in that way? And thinking it through, young people have got student debt, they can't get on the property market. Who wouldn't, and they're also seeing a lot on social media, who wouldn't fall prey to what I would call a get rich quick scheme? Now, I'm not saying that crypto is necessarily that, but you can understand why some of the behaviours were playing out. So I think for me, at the moment, I always say if I go under a bus tomorrow, then my hard-earned cash will go to him and then go into crypto, and that's not really what I want necessarily. So there's an education piece here, isn't there? And it's about talking around things like diversification, but maybe in a different way. because that sounds really technical, and just thinking about what these behaviours are like, but what's driving them. And then for me, it's around advisors who are starting to have conversations with that next generation, really understanding what is all this stuff. I thought crypto was bad enough, but my second son then told me he was using NFTs. I didn't have a clue what he was talking about, which is part of the reason that we developed the guide, to help advisors get educated. I think it's a long answer, but when we first started to talk about this, we focused our efforts on young people. And an advisor at one of my sessions, it said at the end, the Q&A, this is a statement. This is not just about young people. We're seeing older, vulnerable people also investing a lot of money in crypto. And they had direct experience of a client who'd lost £200,000. Now, it was a scam. It wasn't actually because crypto had taken a dive. And just so we need to be better equipped at just talking about some of the broader challenges of online investing and recognising vulnerability, which, as we all know, is really key from an FCA standpoint.
Yeah, well, I mean, crikey, you could talk about this all day, couldn't you? I mean, I don't. If everyone picked up on the number last week that a survey had spotted that more than half of all consumers in the UK would be designated vulnerable under the current definitions coming out of the regulator, and yet here we are talking about an issue that's completely unregulated. I mean, it's very odd, isn't it, if you look at it as an outsider? I mean, I think in some respects there's a bit of a fine line between it, being a bit of a disaster and putting people off, as I talked about earlier on, but it would probably be very, very helpful to getting the message around diversification of different asset classes if there were one or two more high-profile disasters that actually meant people got their fingers burned. And in some respects, this is no different. We've all had conversations with clients who believe that property is a one-way gig and that all my pension assets should be in property. Why wouldn't they be? Because it's absolutely fantastic. Well, they're not going to be thinking that in 18 months' time, are they, if they've gone and geared themselves up with buy-to-let and they can't get it rented because people can't afford the rents to cover the mortgage which has risen. I mean, that was, it was lunacy when they did it, and it's lunacy now, So this is not just a young person's issue. We've always had to face in to people believing that there are simple ways or simpler ways to get to where they want to get to than the hard yards of getting a plan, sticking to it, amending it and getting diversification. So this is not a new phenomenon, it's just a new asset class.
I think also what's important is that we shouldn't confuse crypto or digital assets with the technology itself.
Correct.
So, without getting into the detail, but, distributed ledger technology will give us, I think, significant possibilities in terms of new product development. So personalization being a great example. How could we use tokenization to deliver personalized sustainable products, for example, or personalized drawdown products? And here at Schroders, we took a minority stake in a crypto business, and people were like, why did you do that? Well, we've got to continue to educate ourselves, but also look at the future. Have we reached peak funds? If you speak to anyone in the US, the answer to that is probably yes. So we just got to keep looking at where does technology enable us to deliver products to meet the kind of outcomes that clients need to achieve. So I think it's really important that we don't sit here saying crypto is really bad. That's not actually our message. We need to understand it better, but we also need to have eyes open as to the future possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, the ability to just, put simply, to unitize non-unitizable entities is actually widens out the potential investment universe, and that's a good thing, if it's handled appropriately. I think the broader AI question is interesting because I think depending on what people interpret that to mean, I think you'll get a different answer. So I think for some people in the advice world, the fear is that it entirely replaces the need for an advisor and it just takes it out altogether. And I've never believed that. I think this is always complementary technology, because in the end, the biggest single thing we sell is human contact, belief, and trust. And that's actually non-programmable. Well, at least it currently is.
I think technological change is always something that challenges people because it's hard to imagine what the future looks like. You only need to go back and look at some of the advances of a mobile phone, the internet. These are things where before they existed, it was really difficult to understand what does the world look like in this space. And I think that's probably why people are threatened, because there's an unknown almost. And trying to piece that together, I think the best starting point is education. So educate yourself, learn about things, be open-minded, and try and find the ways that it enhances as opposed to detracts. And I think that that's really going to be the key to actually succeeding in a new world that we don't actually know how that will look exactly.
I mean, the mobile phone example is a spot on one, because think back to the early technology. There were no characters for text because they never believed anyone would want to text. It was going to be a voice medium. And then suddenly text dominates, and now it's going back to being a voice medium, because every app's about how do you send messages and videos and communicate in a different way that isn't just written. So it's ebbed and flowed, hasn't it, in a way that nobody predicted it from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, lots of fascinating thoughts there on technology. Just a quick reminder, we've got a couple of minutes left, so do get your questions in now. Gillian and Olivia, just going back a little bit to the advisors that you did survey for this. Somebody has asked, have you broken down the data to look at the different types of advisors that have answered? So, for example, have you broken it down by advisors that are chartered versus those that aren't, say, to see what the differences are?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question, and the answer to that is no. We do break it down by independent and restricted. I don't have the numbers to hand, but part of the reason that we don't ask up front for lots of information about the advisor firms is we're just really keen for them to actually respond to the survey. And also realise that the survey, when we send that out right across our database, is not a marketing opportunity. So anybody that completes the survey, we don't suddenly chase them up and engage and harass them, if I could say that. So we just feel that we at this point, we don't want to dig too deeply into some of the demographics, although it's an interesting one. For some reason, we've been asked a lot about that in this round. So we may look at some of the data that we want to ask. But I guess my response to that is, I just don't want all of that to get in the way of advisors just sitting down and answering and spending time thinking about the survey.
Perfect, thank you for that. Philip, we've got quite a good question here that's talking about, I guess, the average age of an advisor versus technology and use and understanding. So what's your thought there? I mean, is tech a young advisor's game, or is it for everybody?
Oh, I thought the question was going to be, are they ever going to get any younger? Gillian and I joke about this quite a lot. I mean, I've been in this industry for 35 years, and the average age of an advisor has been 57 since I started, and it is now. So, I mean, I failed the actuarial exams, but even my arithmetic tells me we must have brought some young ones in somewhere. Otherwise the average is all wrong. So, no, of course it's not. I mean, I think. Of course, it's not. You've only got to look at wider technology. How many people's parents and grandparents were the first to embrace FaceTime and Zoom during the lockdown? Of course, it's not. Things that you never thought were ever going to happen. So, of course, it's not a young person's game. I think there's probably more enthusiasm, or the enthusiasm levels are going to be higher amongst younger people because they're less resistant to change, and that's just a natural human phenomenon. I mean, I'd be horrified if I felt it was resistant to change, because it's what I always railed against. But I'm sure I am in certain respects as I've got older. So I wouldn't be narrow-minded in thinking that it's just a young person's game. I think probably being able to embrace the possibilities and see how it might fit into a model is going to require quite a lot of gusto and oomph and and drive. And it might be that there are some advisors coming towards the end of their career who just think, well, don't really want to go around this loop one more time. I've only got 3 years left. So I think that might play into it. But in principle, of course it's not a young person's game. We're all going to face into it. We already do. I mean, you've been facing into AI for the last 10 years every time you called a call centre. Various different forms, haven't you?
I'm with you on this one, Philip. I just think in my experience, they learn a lot quicker than I do. If that's...
Well, I think the trouble with change is when things are new, it's not just about learning something new, it's about unlearning something that you already know.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it becomes challenging, because you've done something in a certain way for a certain period of time. And now if you have to start undoing any of that to learn the next new thing, that's where the challenge comes in.
Yeah, I guess as well, if you look at the rapid adoption of platforms, and I worked on one of the first platforms in the UK market, and it was really challenging at that point. to get advisors, moving into that and using that technology. And that was all about change, and we can understand it because we're creatures of habit, I think, aren't we? We don't really like change particularly well. So
yeah, I think too that this one has has the potential to be, because its potential is so great and its potential impact on parts of the population are so great, there's going to be a far wider fear than just the change. It's going to be, what's it actually going to mean for me? I mean, I think, right across the piece, if you're a general practitioner, you're probably thinking, what does my job look like in 5 years' time? You don't need somebody to look up the book and work through the probabilities and come to an educated judgment if a machine can do it faster. And that will be the same in back offices and support mechanisms. A lot of people will be fearful. So the difficulty in implementing it will be to bring people along at the same time.
You're right, because there has been, hasn't there, some doom and gloom headlines about job losses and what the future impact is, and we'll all go down to 3-day weeks because the robots will take over. So I think we've got to get this in balance, don't we?
Yeah, well, with job losses, there comes job creation. It's just in a form, again, like we just don't know what that looks like.
Yeah. So
it provides opportunity.
It doesn't feel completely outlandish to be starting to describe it in the same terms as the Industrial Revolution. It has that potential, doesn't it? Whether it does or not, it depends on how we decide to go about it. But it does have that potential.
Yeah.
Well, look, we are getting towards 2 o'clock. So on a final note before we finish, I'd like to ask the three of you to please kindly share one key takeaway from this pulse survey. What would you like to tell the advisors? What's the main thing that has stuck out to you, or a word of wisdom that you want to leave everybody with after today? Olivia, could I start with you?
Sure. I think for me, I'm going to take it to the cash versus investing. And I think you can never remind people enough about the power of diversification. And I think I mentioned it to Philip as well, you can't put a price on peace of mind. And so I think long-term investing is the way to go to achieve financial outcomes. It's about the peace of mind that financial advisors can then provide to clients who are investing so that they can stick the course, stay invested in that journey, because it is ultimately a journey. And to not capitulate on investments, to not be fearful, because you're in good hands, right? You're in the hands of experts who are, if they're outsourcing investments or if they're spending their time building those portfolios, it's something that's going to help you achieve those long-term outcomes. Cash is going to be the thing that ultimately doesn't get you to beat inflation, which is currently the hot topic. But even just in terms of long-term success, it's about sticking the course of that journey and pulling in, that ability to take on risk, willingness to take on risk, and then ultimately your capacity for loss. And from my perspective, there are no better people to do that than financial advisors.
Thank you. Gillian?
I'll keep it brief. I think I'd go back to the consumer duty conversation, particularly around the ongoing charging model. I think what the survey has demonstrated, as I mentioned earlier, that a number of ways that advisors absolutely demonstrate the value of ongoing advice. And I think we're going to make sure that we can get that across as an industry, particularly when faced with some of the challenges around price and value from the consumer duty outcomes. So for me, I think it gave us lots of information and lots of, I guess, maybe I call it the case for the defence, right, in terms of ongoing charging models. But for me, the survey gave us lots to talk about in that area.
Fantastic. And Philip?
Well, I guess mine would be a message of positivity. I think it is far, far better for an advice sector when it's operating in times of turmoil and change and volatility, because its strengths should come to the fore. So all of this, while it's chaotic and while clients need more reassurance and more hand-holding and greater support, actually will lead to far greater, stronger relationships, not just with them, but across their deeper family, which will lead to us all having more valuable businesses as a consequence. So I think we should be positive because it plays entirely into our strengths.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for those wonderful answers to finish things off, and for all of your answers in our Q&A session this afternoon. For our listeners, if your question was not answered in the time available, please don't worry. We will send it across to the good folks at Schroders and they will respond to you personally. Now, just before we go, let's take one last look at those learning objectives, which are up on the screen now. Excellent. So before we close up, just one more quick reminder that your CPD will be delivered tomorrow, but of course, only if we can see your full name. So please make sure that your full name is available on your picture on Zoom, or else you can email the email that has been put in the chat box by one of my colleagues. Now, before we sign off, just a reminder of some of the dates for your diary for the coming months. On the 9th of August, we're partnering with Baillie Gifford to bring you another digital working lunch, this time looking at their Positive Change Fund with client director Rosie Rankin. After a short break for the summer, PA will be back on the road again for our autumn multi-asset roadshow. So you'll find us in Harrogate on the 13th of September, in Knutsford on the 14th, in Cardiff, which is a brand new destination for us, on the 19th, in Bristol on the 20th, and in London on the 21st. Keynote speaker on the roadshow is the Advisor Centre's Managing Director and CIO at Embark, Peter Toogood. And you're going to hear presentations from Brooks McDonald, Downing FM, Invesco, and 2 more exciting speakers to be announced shortly. The following week will be in Edinburgh on the 27th of September, and on the 28th, we will be in Glasgow for our Scotland Investment Roadshow, and more information will be available on that in the coming weeks. And finally, if you're within driving distance of Warrington, we'll be at the Park Royal Hotel and Conference Centre for our annual PA360 North Conference on the 4th of October. This is the largest management conference for financial advisors in the north of England, and will feature presentations from over 30 speakers. It starts at 10 and it ends at 3:30, so that you can get away before the afternoon rush hour begins. So that will be well worth a visit. All in all, that's 13 hours of CPD for you, and you can find details of all these events and register for any of them on the PA website under the events tab. So that's it for today. All that remains is for me to thank you so much for your company this lunchtime. I trust you found this session helpful, and if you did, hopefully we will see you at another PA event very soon. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.